When desperate cowboy Silas McKenna trades his father's silver watch for what he thinks is just a donkey, he discovers the deal includes a mail-order bride arrangement, and Elena Vasquez arrives, expecting to marry a dead man. But as their unlikely partnership blooms into something deeper, while mining for gold in the treacherous Wyoming mountains, a face from Elena's past emerges with evidence that she orchestrated the Apache raid that killed her own family. Can a woman who betrayed her blood for silver ever find redemption, or will the truth about her past destroy the only honest love she's ever known? A silver watch spun through the air, catching sunlight like a falling star before landing in the auctioneer's calloused palm. The crowd of desperate men pressed closer, their eyes hungry as wolves watching fresh meat. This was how fortunes changed hands in the Wyoming territory owned toss at a time. Silas McKenna wiped sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. August 1867 had been the hottest month anyone could remember, and his empty stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside. 3 days without food made a man think crazy thoughts, made him consider trades that would make his dead father roll over in his grave. $37? Jeremiah Colt's voice boomed across the trading post like thunder before a storm. Going once for the donkey and the bride papers. The words hit Silas like a punch to the gut. Bride papers? He'd been so focused on that gray donkey, the one with intelligent brown eyes and sturdy legs, that he'd missed half of what was being sold. His hand shot up anyway, sealing a deal he didn't fully understand. Around him, weathered faces turned his way. Some showed pity, others amusement. Old Pete Jackson spat tobacco juice in the dirt and shook his head. Boy just bought himself more trouble than he knows what to do with. But Silas wasn't listening to the crowd anymore. He was watching the donkey, who had lifted his head and was staring right back at him. Those dark eyes seemed to hold secrets, like they'd seen more of the world than most people ever would. The animal's coat was dusty but well kept, and something about his calm presence made Silas feel less alone for the first time in months. Sold to the young man with the rifle. Colt's gavel crashed down like a judge's verdict. You got yourself a donkey and a mail-order bride arrangement, son. Hope you know what you're doing. The crowd began to scatter, but Silas stood frozen in place. His father's watch, the only thing left of the man who'd raised him, was gone forever. In return, he owned a donkey and apparently some kind of marriage contract he'd never asked for. His name's Tobias, said a gentle voice beside him. Silas turned to find Pastor Williams, a silver-haired man whose kind eyes had seen plenty of desperate souls pass through this territory. I knew the previous owner. Good man, taken by fever last month. This donkey's got more sense than most people I've met. Silas approached Tobias slowly, the way his father had taught him to approach any new animal. The donkey didn't shy away. Instead, he extended his neck, letting Silas run a hand along his warm coat. Beneath the dust, Silas could feel strong muscles and steady breathing. This wasn't some worn-out pack animal ready for the glue factory. This was a working partner who could make the difference between life and death in the mountains. What about the other part? Silas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The bride thing? Pastor Williams pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket. The paper was soft from handling, like someone had read it many times. Her name's Elena Vasquez. Coming from New Mexico territory on next Tuesday's train. She's been writing to Samuel Morrison for 3 months, planning to marry him and start fresh. Silas's stomach dropped. But Morrison's dead. That he is. Hart gave out 3 weeks ago. His relatives sold everything, including, the pastor gestured at the letter. Well, including this arrangement. Taking the letter felt like holding a snake that might bite. Silas unfolded it carefully, squinting at the careful handwriting inside. Each letter was formed perfectly, the way someone writes when they want to make a good impression. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. She doesn't know he's dead, Silas realized. No, she doesn't. Far as Elena Vasquez knows, she's coming here to marry Samuel Morrison and start a new life. Instead, she's going to find a dead man's grave and a confused young fellow who bought her papers by accident. The weight of responsibility settled on Silas's shoulders, like a heavy blanket. Somewhere in New Mexico, A woman was packing her belongings and saying goodbye to whatever life she was leaving behind. She was counting on finding a husband, a home, maybe even happiness. Instead, she was going to find disappointment and a stranger who didn't want a wife. Tobias nudged Silas's shoulder with his nose, a gentle reminder that some problems couldn't be solved by standing still and worrying. The donkey's touch was warm and steady, like a friend offering comfort without words. "What kind of woman is she?" Silas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Pastor William studied the letter over Silas's shoulder. Lost her family in Apache raids, according to this. No relatives left. Nowhere else to go. Says she can read and write in English and Spanish. Knows about farming and taking care of animals. Sounds like she's had to be strong to survive what she's been through. Silas folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket next to where his father's watch used to rest. The empty space felt cold against his ribs. "When did you say the train arrives?" "Tuesday morning, 5 days from now." 5 days to figure out how to tell a stranger that her future had just disappeared like smoke in the wind. 5 days to decide whether he was the kind of man who would abandon a woman at a train station or try to help her somehow. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and purple above the distant mountains. Tobias stood patiently beside him, ready to follow wherever Silas decided to go. The donkey's presence was oddly comforting, like having a loyal friend who didn't judge or ask difficult questions. "Well, Tobias," Silas said quietly, running his hand along the donkey's neck one more time, "looks like we're about to find out what kind of men we really are." The donkey's only response was a soft snort, but somehow it felt like understanding. Together, they walked away from the trading post toward an uncertain future, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the evening wind. Behind them, the auctioneer was already setting up for the next day's business, ready to trade away more dreams and desperate hopes. But ahead of them lay the open road, full of possibilities that Silas couldn't even imagine yet. The train's whistle screamed across the prairie like a wounded animal, announcing the arrival of Tuesday Morning and Elena Vasquez. Silas stood on the platform at Cheyenne Station, his hat twisted between nervous hands, and his stomach churning worse than butter in a storm. Beside the hitching post, Tobias watched the great iron beast approach with calm interest, as if trains were nothing more than large, noisy cousins of the wagons he was used to carrying. Steam hissed from the locomotive's sides as it ground to a halt, and passengers began climbing down onto the wooden platform. Silas studied each face, looking for the woman who was about to have her world turned upside down. Travel-weary souls stepped into the Wyoming sunshine, blinking and stretching after days of sitting in cramped compartments. Then he saw her. Elena Vasquez was exactly what she'd promised in her letter, wearing a blue dress that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she carried a small carpet bag that probably held everything she owned in the world. She wasn't beautiful in the way of women in picture books, but there was something in the way she held herself that spoke of quiet strength. Their eyes met across the busy platform, and Silas watched recognition dawn on her face. She walked toward him with steady steps, her chin held high despite the uncertainty he could see flickering in her dark eyes. Her boots made soft clicking sounds on the wooden boards, each step bringing her closer to the truth that would shatter her plans. "Samuel Morrison?" she asked when she reached him. Her voice carried the musical sounds of Spanish underneath her careful English, like a song playing softly in the background. Silas swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as desert sand. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something important. Samuel Morrison. He died 3 weeks ago. Heart failure. I'm Silas McKenna, and I." The words stuck in his throat like thorns. "I bought your arrangement at an auction." He watched her face carefully, expecting tears or anger or the kind of collapse that comes when hope dies suddenly. Instead, Elena's expression grew thoughtful, and she glanced from Silas to Tobias and back again. Her eyes were intelligent, taking in details and making calculations he couldn't guess at. "You bought me?" she asked quietly, her voice steady as stone. "Not you," Silas said quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his rush to explain. "The arrangement. The papers. I was trying to buy the donkey, and the auctioneer sold them together. I didn't know, I didn't think. You needed the donkey more than you needed a wife, Elena said, and to Silas's amazement, there was no bitterness in her voice. That is practical. I respect practical decisions. She walked over to Tobias, who had turned to watch their conversation with the kind of attention that made Silas think the donkey understood more than he let on. Elena extended her hand slowly, letting Tobias sniff her fingers before gently stroking his gray neck. The donkey's ears pricked forward, and he made a soft sound that might have been approval. He is beautiful, she said, running her fingers through Tobias's coarse mane. Strong and patient. You chose well. His name is Tobias, Silas said, feeling strangely proud of the compliment. He's been a good friend. Elena nodded, then turned back to Silas with eyes that seemed to see right through him. So what happens now? Do you send me back to New Mexico? Do you leave me here at the station to figure things out on my own? The questions hit Silas like stones thrown at his chest. He'd been so focused on telling her the truth that he hadn't thought beyond that moment. Now, faced with her calm acceptance and the reality of her situation, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. I don't know, he admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. I don't have much. A mining claim up in the hills, a cabin that needs work, enough supplies to last maybe a month. It's not what you were promised. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on Tobias's neck. The donkey seemed to lean into her touch, as if he'd already decided she belonged with them. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but determined. I have nowhere else to go, she said simply, and you seem like a good man, honest at least. Perhaps we can help each other. Help each other how? Silas asked, though part of him was already hoping she'd found a solution to their impossible situation. You need someone to cook and mend and keep house while you work your claim. I need a place to stay and honest work to do. We could be business partners, until I can save enough money to start over somewhere else. Silas considered her proposal. It made sense in the practical way that frontier life demanded. They both had needs the other could meet, and Elena was clearly not the helpless city woman he'd been worried about. Anyone who could look at a broken plan and immediately start building a new one had the kind of backbone the territory required. The cabin's pretty rough, he warned. Leaky roof, cracked windows, and it's a long way from town. 15 miles of hard riding through country that can kill you if you're not careful. I grew up on a farm in New Mexico, Elena replied. I know about hard work and dangerous country. I can shoot, I can cook over an open fire, and I can fix most things that break. She paused, studying his face. Unless you'd rather I took the next train east and forgot this ever happened. No, Silas said quickly, surprising himself with how much he meant it. I think we could make it work. As partners. Elena smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she stepped off the train. It transformed her whole face, making her eyes light up and showing him a glimpse of who she might be when she wasn't carrying the weight of disappointment. Partners, she agreed, extending her hand for him to shake. Her grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of someone who wasn't afraid of honest work. As their hands met, Silas felt something shift inside his chestnut love. Exactly, but the beginning of respect and maybe even friendship. We should get moving, Elena said, shouldering her carpet bag. 15 miles is a long ride, and I'd like to see this cabin before dark. Tobias seemed to agree, stepping forward eagerly, as if he was ready to show Elena their home. The donkey's enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time since the auction, Silas found himself looking forward to something instead of just worrying about survival. As they prepared to leave Cheyenne Station, Elena paused and looked back at the train that had brought her here. I thought I was coming to start a marriage, she said quietly. Instead, I'm starting a partnership. Perhaps that's better. Partnerships are built on respect instead of promises. Silas followed her gaze to the locomotive, which was already preparing for its next journey. Are you disappointed? Elena considered the question seriously before answering. I'm hopeful, she said finally, and hope is better than disappointment any day. Together, they walked away from the station toward whatever future they could build together. with Tobias leading the way like he knew exactly where they belonged. The roof leaked exactly where Elena said it would. Water dripped steadily through a gap in the wooden shingles, landing with soft plops in the tin bucket she'd placed beneath it during their first night in the cabin. Silas woke to the sound and found her already up, stirring something that smelled like heaven in a pot over the fire. "Coffee?" she asked without turning around, as if she'd known he was awake before he did. The cabin looked different in the morning, light, not better, exactly, but more like a place where people actually lived instead of just survived. Elena had already moved their supplies into organized piles, hung her spare dress on a wooden peg, and somehow made the cramped space feel less like a shelter and more like a home. "How did you sleep?" Silas asked, accepting the steaming cup she handed him. The coffee was stronger than anything he'd made for himself, rich and dark with just a hint of something spicy he couldn't identify. "I've slept in worse places," Elena said, settling beside the fire with her own cup. "The roof can be fixed. The walls are solid, and the location is good, high enough to see trouble coming, close enough to the stream for water. This can work." Silas studied her face in the firelight, looking for signs that she was just being polite. But Elena's expression was calm and practical, the look of someone who'd learned to see possibilities where others saw only problems. "You really think so?" "I know so. My father built our house in New Mexico from nothing but timber and determination. This cabin has good boneset, just needs someone to care about it again." They spent the morning exploring their new home properly. Elena moved through the small space, like she was taking inventory, testing floorboards with her foot, checking the stability of the walls, examining the stone fireplace for cracks. She found problems Silas had missed and solutions he'd never considered. "See this?" She pointed to a gap between two logs where cold air was seeping through. "Pine pitch and cloth strips will seal that right up. And here," she gestured toward a corner where the floor sagged slightly, "we need to shore up this support beam before winter, or the whole corner might collapse." Silas watched her work with growing amazement. Where he saw overwhelming tasks, Elena saw manageable projects. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd solved similar problems before, her hands sure and steady as she examined each issue. Outside, Tobias grazed contentedly in the small meadow behind the cabin. The donkey had found a patch of sweet grass near the stream and seemed perfectly happy with his new surroundings. Every now and then, he'd lift his head to check on them, his ears swiveling to track their movements. "He's protective," Elena observed, following Silas's gaze. "Good trait in a working animal." "He's more than that," Silas said. "Sometimes I think he understands everything that's happening, like he's got more sense than most people." Elena smiled. "Animals often do. They see what's real instead of what people pretend is real." That afternoon, they rode to the nearest town for supplies. Elena sat behind Silas on Tobias's back, her arms around his waist for balance. The donkey carried them both without complaint, his steady gait eating up the miles between their cabin and civilization. Millerville was barely more than a wide spot in the Rhoda General Store, a blacksmith shop, a saloon, and a handful of houses scattered along a dusty main street. But it had what they needed: tools, nails, cloth, and food that wouldn't spoil on the ride home. The storekeeper, a thin man named Henderson, eyed Elena with curiosity. "Don't get many Mexican ladies through here," he said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of someone who said whatever came to mind. "I'm from New Mexico territory," Elena replied calmly, "and I need fabric for patching, if you have it." Henderson showed them to the dry goods section, where bolts of cloth lined the shelves in neat rows. Elena ran her fingers over the materials, testing their weight and durability. She chose practical fabric chevi canvas for patches, lighter cotton for clothing repairs, strong thread that wouldn't break under stress. While Elena shopped, Silas gathered tools and hardware. He bought a hammer, nails, a saw, and strips of metal for reinforcing weak spots in the cabin structure. The purchases took most of their remaining money, but Elena nodded approvingly at each choice. "You think like a builder," she said as they loaded their supplies onto Tobias's back. "That's good. Most men think like buyers. They want to purchase solutions instead of creating them." The ride home was comfortable in a way that surprised Silas. Elena's presence behind him felt natural, like they'd been traveling together for years instead of days. She pointed out landmarks, identified edible plants along the trail, and shared stories about her childhood that painted pictures of a life very different from his own. "My grandmother taught me about plants," she said as they passed a stand of pine trees. "She could cure almost anything with the right combination of bark and leaves and roots. People came from 3 villages away to seek her help." "What happened to her?" Elena's arms tightened slightly around his waist. "She died the winter before the raids. Old age, nothing violent. I think she was lucky to go peacefully." There was something in her voice that made Silas want to ask more questions, but he held back. Elena would share what she wanted to share when she was ready. Pushing for details would only make her retreat into herself. Back at the cabin, they worked until the sun began to set behind the mountains. Elena proved to be as skilled with tools as she was with words, her hands sure and steady as she helped Silas seal gaps in the walls and shore up weak floorboards. They moved around each other efficiently, anticipating each other's needs without having to ask. "You're good at this," Silas said, as Elena expertly mixed pine pitch with cloth fibers to create weatherproof patches. "I had a good teacher," she replied. "My father believed everyone should know how to fix what breaks. He said depending on others to solve your problems was a kind of weakness." As darkness fell, they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The cabin felt warmer now, more solid, like it was beginning to remember what it meant to be a home. Tobias had wandered close to the door, and Silas could hear the soft sounds of the donkey settling down for the night. "Silas," Elena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence. "Why mining? Why not farming or ranching like most men out here?" Silas poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks dance up toward the patched roof. "My father was a prospector. He spent years searching these mountains, convinced there was gold hidden somewhere in the rocks. He died before he could prove it, but he left me his maps and his tools." "And his dreams?" The question caught Silas off guard. He'd never thought of his father's obsession with gold as dreams, more like a fever that had consumed the man's life and left his son with nothing but holes in the ground and empty promises. "Maybe," he said finally, "though I'm not sure dreams are worth much if they keep you from living in the real world." Elena nodded slowly. "Dreams can be dangerous, but so can giving up on them too quickly." She pulled something from her poqueta folded piece of paper that looked like it had been handled many times. Unfolding it carefully, she showed Silas a hand-drawn map covered with symbols and Spanish words. "My father drew this before he died," she said. "He marked places where he'd seen signs of silver in the mountains near our farm. He never had time to investigate properly, but he always believed there was treasure waiting for someone patient enough to look." Silas studied the map, trying to make sense of the markings and notations. "Do you think he was right?" "I think he was a man who needed something to hope for," Elena said, folding the map again. "But that doesn't mean he was wrong." As they prepared for sleep, Elena's words echoed in Silas's mind. Maybe the difference between dreamers and fools wasn't the dreams themselves, but whether you had someone to share them with. A sound like thunder rolled across the valley, but the sky was clear as glass above the mountain peaks. Silas jerked awake, his hand reaching instinctively for the rifle beside his bedroll. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the cabin walls and rattling the tin plates on their makeshift table. "Avalanche," Elena whispered from her place by the dying fire. "Wrong season," Silas replied, pulling on his boots. "Something else." Through the cracked window, he could see dust rising from the valley below, a brown cloud that meant horses, and lots of them. Riders moving fast toward their cabin, close enough now that the thunder of hoofbeats was unmistakable. Elena was already moving, gathering their most valuable possessions with the swift efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack quickly. She rolled their remaining money into a tight bundle, tucked her father's map inside her dress, and shouldered her small bag without wasting a motion. "How many?" she asked, checking the loads in her pistol. Silas counted the dust clouds. 5, maybe 6, armed and riding hard. Law or outlaws. Does it matter? Either way, they're not coming for tea and conversation. Outside, Tobias had lifted his head from grazing, His ears pricked forward as he studied the approaching riders. The donkey's calm demeanor hadn't changed, but Silas could see the tension in his stance, ready to run if necessary, but not panic. "We could make a stand here," Elena said, checking the rifle's sights. "Not against 6 men. Better to get to high ground and see what they want." They gathered their essential supplies quickly, loading what they could carry onto Tobias's back. The donkey stood perfectly still as they secured the packs, his intelligent eyes tracking the dust cloud that was now close enough to make out individual horses. "There," Elena pointed toward a rocky outcrop above the cabin. "Good cover. Clear view of the approach." They climbed quickly, leading Tobias up a narrow game trail that wound between the boulders. The donkey navigated the steep path with sure-footed confidence, never balking at the treacherous footing or the loose rocks that scattered beneath their feet. From their hiding place, they watched the riders thunder into the clearing below. 6 men, all armed, all moving, with the purposeful intensity of people on serious business. The leader wore a star on his chest that caught the morning sunlight. "Marshals," Silas breathed. "Looking for someone," Elena added, studying the way the men spread out to search the cabin and surrounding area. One of the riders, a tall man with graying hair, called out in a voice that carried clearly up the mountainside. "Silas McKenna, we know you're here somewhere. Come down peaceful, and nobody gets hurt." Silas felt Elena's hand close around his arm. "What do they want with you?" "I don't know," he said, but cold certainty was already settling in his stomach. "I've never broken any laws, never been in trouble. The only thing I can think of is—" He stopped, remembering the auction, the hasty transaction, the papers that had changed hands, along with his father's watch. "The marriage arrangement," Elena finished. Maybe there was something illegal about how it was sold. It made sense in the twisted way that legal troubles often did. Property disputes, improper documentation, unpaid debts, any number of things could bring marshals to a man's door. The frontier was full of complications that seemed simple until lawyers got involved. "Or they think you're someone else," Elena suggested. "Mistaken identity happens all the time out here." From below, they could hear the marshals searching through their belongings, calling out to each other as they examined the cabin and the surrounding area. Their voices carried on the mountain air, fragments of conversation that revealed nothing useful. "Tracks lead this way. Fresh supplies. They're close. Check the ridge. We need to get closer," Elena said suddenly. "Listen to what they're really saying." "Too dangerous," Silas protested. "If they catch us, if we run without knowing why they're here, we'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders," Elena interrupted. "I will not live that way." Her voice carried a steel that brooked no argument, and Silas realized she was right. Running from unknown trouble was just trading one problem for a bigger one. Better to understand what they were facing. "I'll go," he said. "You stay with Tobias." "No," Elena's tone was firm. "I move quieter than you, and if something goes wrong, you'll need to get Tobias and our supplies to safety." Before Silas could argue further, Elena was already moving, slipping down the rocky slope with the silent grace of someone who'd learned to move unseen. She disappeared into the shadows between the boulders, leaving Silas alone with Tobias and his own growing anxiety. The wait was torture. Silas lay flat against the rocks, watching the cabin below and straining his ears for any sound that might indicate Elena was in trouble. Tobias seemed to sense his worry, moving closer and resting his warm muzzle against Silas's shoulder. "She'll be fine," Silas whispered, as much to convince himself as the donkey. "She knows what she's doing." But minutes stretched like hours, and every sound from below made his heart race. The marshals continued their search, their voices growing more frustrated as they failed to find their quarry. One of them kicked at their fire pit, scattering cold ashes across the ground. Finally, Elena reappeared beside him, materializing out of the morning shadows like a ghost. Her face was grim with news that Silas already knew would change everything. "They're looking for someone named Silas McKenna," she whispered. "But not you. They're hunting a bank robber who hit the First National in Laramie 6 months ago. Young man, medium height, dark hair, carries a rifle." Relief and dread hit Silas simultaneously. Mistaken identity. "Yes," but they're convinced you're their man. The leader, Marshal Garethi's been tracking this robber for months. He won't give up easily, especially not on a hunch. What do we do? Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking with the careful deliberation of someone whose next words might determine their future. We have 3 choices. Run and keep running until they give up or catch us. Surrender and hope they believe your story. Or what? Or we prove you're not the man they're looking for. Silas stared at her. How do we do that? The bank robber has a scar on his left hand. I heard them talking about it. You don't have a scar. If we can show them that, they'll have to admit they have the wrong man. And if they don't believe us? Elena's hand found his in the morning shadows, her fingers warm and steady. Then we run, but together. The word hit Silas like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because of how right it sounded. Somewhere in the space of a few days, this stranger had become his partner in ways that went far beyond their practical arrangement. She was willing to risk her life to help clear his name, and the trust implicit in that gesture was worth more than any gold hidden in the mountains. All right, he said, but we do this carefully. One mistake. There won't be any mistakes, Elena said with quiet confidence. I have a plan. Below them, the marshals were preparing to expand their search, their horses stamping impatiently as the men studied the surrounding terrain. Time was running out, and whatever Elena had in mind, they needed to act soon. Tobias stood between them, patient and loyal as always, ready to carry them toward whatever future their next decision would create. The donkey's presence was steadying, a reminder that some things in life, friendship, loyalty, trust, were simple even when everything else became complicated. Tell me your plan, Silas said, squeezing Elena's hand. And as she began to speak, he realized that for the first time since his father's death, he wasn't facing his troubles alone. Elena stumbled into the marshal's camp like a woman who'd been walking all night, her hair messy and her dress torn in just the right places to look believable. Her performance was so convincing that even Silas, watching from the ridge above, almost believed she was truly lost and desperate. Gracias a Dios! Thank God! She called out, her voice carrying exactly the right mix of relief and exhaustion. I thought I would die up here. The marshals were on their feet instantly, hands moving toward their weapons before they recognized Elena as a woman in distress. Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his weathered face showing cautious concern as he approached the stranger who'd appeared from nowhere. Ma'am, what are you doing way up here alone? Garrett asked, his sharp eyes already scanning the rocks behind her for signs of trouble. I'm not alone, Elena said, accepting the cup of coffee that one of the younger deputies offered her. My husband and I were traveling to Cheyenne. But our horse threw a shoe yesterday, and we had to make camp. This morning, I went looking for water and got turned around in all these rocks. Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Elena weave her story with masterful skill. Every gesture, every pause, every tremor in her voice was perfectly calculated to make the marshals believe she was exactly what she appeared to be, frightened woman who'd gotten separated from her traveling companion. Your husband? Garrett's voice sharpened with interest. Where is he now? Back at our camp, trying to fix the shoe. He sent me to find help, but I got lost instead. Elena looked around the marshal's camp with apparent confusion. You're lawmen, aren't you? Perhaps you could help us. This was Silas's cue. He stood up on the ridge, making himself clearly visible to the men below, and called out in a voice designed to carry hope and relief. Elena, thank heaven you found someone. He began picking his way down the rocky slope, deliberately using his hands to steady himself on the treacherous terrain. The morning sun caught his palms and fingers as he climbed, showing every line and callus in sharp detail. Most importantly, it revealed the complete absence of any scars. The marshals watched his descent with the intensity of hawks studying a mouse. Silas could feel their eyes cataloging every detail, his height, his build, the way he moved, the rifle slung across his back. He was the right age, the right general appearance, but something wasn't quite matching their expectations. Show me your hands, Marshal Garrett called out when Silas was still 20 yards away. Silas stopped and raised both hands, palms forward, fingers spread wide. The sunlight illuminated his skin clearly, revealing the honest wear of frontier work, but no telltale marks of violence or criminal activity. "Left hand," Garrett demanded, his voice tight with growing frustration. Silas turned his left hand over slowly, displaying both sides for the marshal's inspection. The skin was weathered and scarred from years of hard work, but there was no distinctive mark across his palm, no knife scar, from a Denver fight that had never happened. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered one of the deputies. "He's not our man." Marshal Garrett's face showed the bitter disappointment of a hunter whose prey had just revealed itself to be the wrong animal entirely. "The robber we're tracking has a scar across his left palm from a knife fight 3 years ago. Got it defending himself in a saloon brawl in Denver." "I've never been in a knife fight," Silas said truthfully, "and I've never set foot in Denver." "Can you prove where you were 6 months ago?" Garrett asked, still clinging to the possibility that his long hunt hadn't been wasted. Silas thought carefully. "I was working for Jensen and Sons Freight Company in Laramie. Marcus Jensen will remember me. I hauled supplies for him through most of last winter." The marshal nodded slowly, his professional disappointment warring with relief that an innocent man wouldn't be wrongly arrested. "We'll check your story when we get back to town. In the meantime, you and your wife are free to go." But even as Garrett spoke, Silas noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the civilians riding with the marshal's, a lean man with hungry eyes and a too eager smile, was staring at Elena with an expression that had nothing to do with casual interest. The man stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grudges and unfinished business. Well, Elena Vasquez, I thought you were dead." Elena's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the rocky ground. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the camp. Her face went pale, but her voice remained steady as she responded. "Hello, Diego." Silas felt the world shift beneath his feet. The careful plan they'd executed so perfectly was crumbling, replaced by something far more dangerous. This wasn't about mistaken identity anymore. This was personal, and personal conflicts had a way of destroying everything they touched. Diego Morales looked older than his years, worn down by whatever had brought him to ride with federal marshals in pursuit of bank robbers. His clothes were those of a drifter, but the gun on his hip was well maintained and positioned for a quick draw. "You know this woman?" Marshal Garrett asked, his lawman's instincts immediately alert to the tension crackling between Diego and Elena. "Oh, I know her," Diego said, his smile cold as winter wind. "Elena Vasquez, the saint of San Miguel, the one who walked away clean when the Apache burned out her family's farm." "That's enough," Silas said, stepping protectively closer to Elena. Diego's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You don't know the whole story, do you, friend? Your pretty wife hasn't told you how she survived when everyone else died." "Diego," Elena's voice carried a warning that promised consequences. "Whatever you think you know." "I know exactly what happened that night," Diego interrupted. "I know who really led those Apache raiders to your family's farm. I know who told them where your father kept his money, where your mother hid the silver. I know who walked away with blood on her hands and gold in her pockets." The silence that followed was deafening. Silas felt like he was falling through empty air, watching everything he thought he knew about Elena shatter like her dropped coffee cup. The woman he'd trusted with his life, the partner who'd risked everything to help clear his name, suddenly became a stranger, wearing a familiar face. Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Ma'am, if there's truth to these accusations—" "There's no proof," Elena said quickly. "Diego has hated my family for years. This is revenge. Nothing more." "No proof?" Diego reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a letter from Running Bear himself, written in Spanish and translated by the priest at the mission. It describes his arrangement with a young woman who provided information about Spanish settlements in exchange for safe passage." Silas watched Garrett scan the letter, his professional expression growing grimmer with each line. "It doesn't mention any names," the marshal said finally. "No," Diego admitted, "but it describes a woman with a distinctive rosary, silver and turquoise, made by the craftsmen of Santa Fe, a rosary just like the one Elena's wearing right now." All eyes turned to Elena's hands, where her grandmother's rosary hung from her fingers like an accusation made of precious metal. The silver and turquoise caught the morning light, beautiful and damning in equal measure. "Elena," Silas said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "tell me the truth." She looked at him with eyes full of pain and something that might have been shame. For a long moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, Silas felt his world crumble around him like a house built on sand. When Elena finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one was being dragged from some deep, dark place she'd hoped never to visit again. "My family was starving," she said. 3 years of drought, failed crops, dying livestock. My father owed money to men who would kill him if he couldn't pay." Diego's smile was triumphant and cruel. "So you made a deal with the devil." Elena's composure cracked, tears streaming down her face as the truth finally poured out like poison from a wound. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Running Bear promised me they would raid the farm but let my family escape safely. I thought I was saving them. "But they didn't escape," Silas said, his voice hollow with betrayal. "No," Elena whispered. "They didn't." The weight of Elena's confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, choking off words and hope with equal measure. Silas stared at the woman he'd trusted with his life, searching her tear-streaked face for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake, that Diego's accusations were lies meant to hurt an innocent person. But the truth was written in Elena's expression and the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of carrying secrets for so long, in the trembling of her hands as she clutched her grandmother's rosary, in the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of guilt that had been eating her alive from the inside. "How many died?" Marshal Garrett asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of the law. Elena's answer came in a whisper so soft that everyone had to strain to hear it. 7. My parents, my 2 brothers, my sister Maria, and 2 hired hands who tried to defend the farm." "And you?" Diego pressed, his voice sharp with years of accumulated anger. "How did you manage to survive when everyone else was slaughtered?" "I was in Santa Fe," Elena said, her voice breaking, "creating an alibi, just like Running Bear told me to do. When I came back," she stopped, unable to continue. "When you came back, they were all dead," Diego finished for her, "and you collected your payment from the ashes." "I never took anything," Elena protested, her voice rising with desperate denial. "I never." "You took your grandmother's rosary," Diego said, pointing at the silver and turquoise beads that hung from her fingers like evidence in a trial. "The one piece of value that survived the fire. And then you disappeared, started a new life, with a new story about being a poor orphan seeking a fresh start." Silas felt sick to his stomach. Everything Elena had told him about her past, everything he'd felt for her, was built on a foundation of lies and blood. She hadn't been a victim of Apache raids. She'd been a collaborator who'd sold out her own family for the promise of safety that had turned into slaughter. "Silas," Elena said, reaching toward him with shaking hands, "please, let me explain." He stepped back, away from her touch, away from the woman who'd made him believe in partnerships and trust, and the possibility of building something good together. "Explain what?" "How you got your family killed for money, how you've been lying to me since the moment we met." "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," Elena repeated, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to make him understand. "I thought I was saving them. Running Bear promised—" "Running Bear was a killer," Diego spat, "and you were naive enough to believe the promises of a man who made his living burning out settlers. What did you think would happen when you gave him detailed information about your family's defenses?" Elena's face crumpled as the full horror of her choices crashed down on her. "I was 18 years old and desperate. My father was going to lose the farm anyway. The men he owed money to were threatening to kill him, I thought." She stopped, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I thought I could save everyone." "But you only saved yourself," Silas said, his voice hard with betrayal and disappointment. Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his hand moving to the handcuffs on his belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. There are people in New Mexico territory who want to ask you some questions about those Apache raids." As the marshal moved to arrest Elena, Silas felt a strange numbness settle over him. This morning, he'd had a partner, a woman he'd trusted with his life, and maybe even his heart. Now he had nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal and the cold knowledge that he'd been played for a fool by someone who was very good at making people believe what she wanted them to believe. Elena didn't resist, as Garrett placed the handcuffs on her wrists. She looked small and broken, like a woman who'd been carrying the weight of terrible secrets for too long and was almost relieved to finally let them go. "Silas," she said as the marshal prepared to lead her away, "I want you to know my feelings, for you were real. Everything I felt, everything we built together that wasn't a lie." "How can I believe anything you say?" Silas replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "How do I know what's real and what's just another story you tell to get what you need?" Elena had no answer for that. She looked at him one last time, her dark eyes full of regret and something that might have been love, then allowed Marshal Garrett to lead her toward the horses. Diego watched the proceedings with obvious satisfaction, like a man who'd finally settled an old debt. "Justice catches up with everyone eventually," he said to no one in particular. As the marshals prepared to leave with their prisoner, Silas found himself standing alone in the camp that had been the site of so much hope and betrayal. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber, but the beauty of the landscape felt hollow now, like a painting with all the color drained out. Tobias was waiting on the ridge where they'd left him, patient and loyal as always. The donkey's presence was the only thing that felt real and honest in a world that had suddenly become full of lies and deception. When Silas climbed back up to where the animals stood, Tobias nuzzled his shoulder gently, offering the kind of comfort that didn't require words or explanations. "Well, boy," Silas said, running his hand along the donkey's neck, "looks like it's just you and me again." But even as he spoke the words, Silas realized they weren't entirely true. Elena's betrayal had left him feeling more alone than ever, but it had also taught him something valuable about the difference between partners who earned trust and those who simply claimed it. Tobias had never asked for anything but kindness, and had given everything in return: loyalty, companionship, honest work, and the kind of steady presence that made hard times bearable. The donkey had been worth every penny of his father's silver watch, and maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. Some relationships were built on truth and mutual respect, while others were constructed from lies and desperate need. The trick was learning to tell the difference before you invested your heart in the wrong kind of person. As Silas loaded their remaining supplies onto Tobias's back, he tried not to think about Elena's face as the marshals led her away, or the way she'd looked at him in those final moments. Some mistakes were too big to forgive, and some betrayals cut too deep to heal. But the mountains were still full of possibilities, and there was still gold hidden somewhere in the rocks his father had spent his life searching for. Maybe it was time to stop looking for partners and start trusting the one friend who'd never let him down. "Come on, Tobias," Silas said, checking the donkey's load one last time. "Let's go find that gold." The donkey's ears pricked forward, and for a moment, Silas could have sworn he saw understanding in those dark, intelligent eyes. Together, they walked away from the camp where dreams and deceptions had collided, heading toward a future that might be lonely but would at least be honest. Behind them, the dust cloud raised by the marshal's horses was already disappearing into the distance, carrying Elena and her secrets toward whatever justice awaited her. Silas didn't look back. Some chapters of life needed to end before new ones could begin, and this was one ending he was ready to write. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead, full of promise and possibility, and Tobias's steady gait carried them both toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The first snowflake landed on Silas's nose like a cold kiss from winter itself, melting instantly but carrying the promise of the storm that was building in the dark clouds above. He'd been working his father's mining claim for 3 weeks alone, and the mountain weather was turning nasty earlier than usual this year. Tobias stood nearby, his thick winter coat already growing in preparation for the harsh months ahead. The donkey had proven invaluable during their time at the claim, hauling equipment and ore samples with patient determination, while Silas dug into the mountainside, following his father's old maps and his own growing instincts about where precious metal might hide. Feels like we're going to get hit hard tonight, boy, Silas said, gathering his tools as more snowflakes began to fall. Better get everything secured before this turns into a real storm. The mining camp they'd established was basic but functional, a sturdy tent, reinforced with rocks and logs, a fire pit surrounded by stones, and neat piles of equipment covered with canvas tarps. Silas had learned to live simply during his weeks alone, finding a kind of peace in the routine of daily work and the honest exhaustion that came from digging into solid rock. But tonight felt different. The wind was picking up, whistling through the pine trees, with a sound that made Tobias's ears swivel nervously. The temperature was dropping fast, and the snowflakes were getting bigger and more frequent with each passing minute. As Silas worked to secure their camp, his mind wandered to Elena despite his efforts to keep her memory buried. 3 weeks hadn't been enough time to stop wondering what had happened to her. Whether she was in jail somewhere or she'd managed to convince the authorities that Diego's accusations were lies motivated by old grudges. He shook his head, annoyed with himself for caring about someone who'd betrayed everything he'd thought they shared. Elena had made her choices long before she'd met him, and the consequences of those choices weren't his responsibility. He had enough problems without worrying about a woman who'd sold out her own family. The storm hit just after dark with the fury of something alive and angry. Wind howled around their shelter like a pack of wolves, and snow fell so thick that Silas couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Inside the reinforced tent, he and Tobias huddled together for warmth while the canvas walls flapped and strained against their moorings. "Just you and me against the world, boy," Silas said, running his hand along the donkey's neck. "At least I know you'll never lie to me." Tobias responded with a soft snort that somehow conveyed both agreement and comfort. The donkey's presence was steadying, a reminder that loyalty and trust didn't require complicated explanations or promises that might be broken. Some relationships were simple and honest, built on daily kindness rather than grand gestures. The storm raged for 2 full days, trapping them in their shelter while the world outside disappeared under feet of snow and ice. During the long hours of waiting, Silas found himself examining his father's maps more carefully than ever before, studying the symbols and notations that had guided his digging efforts. One marking in particular caught his attention, a small circle with radiating lines that his father had drawn near what looked like a natural cave formation. Below it, written in his father's careful handwriting, were the words agua y oro, water and gold. "What do you think he meant by that?" Silas asked Tobias, who was dozing peacefully despite the howling wind outside. "Water and gold, like they're connected somehow." The donkey opened one eye and regarded Silas with the patient expression of someone listening to a question he couldn't answer but was willing to consider seriously. When the storm finally blew itself out, they emerged to find a world transformed by winter. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the level places and had drifted even higher against the rocks and trees. The mining equipment was buried under white mounds that looked like small hills, and the trail back to civilization had completely disappeared. "We're stuck until spring," Silas realized, looking at the impassable landscape around them. "Hope we've got enough supplies to last." He'd planned for a long winter, but being completely cut off was more serious than he'd anticipated. Their food would last maybe 2 months if they were careful, and there was no way to get more until the snow melted enough to make travel possible again. But as he began the work of digging out their camp, Silas discovered something that made his heart race with possibility. The storm had knocked down several trees near the cliff face, exposing rock formations that had been hidden beneath their roots. And running through those exposed rocks was a thin vein of something that glittered yellow in the morning sunlight. "Tobias," he breathed, kneeling beside the exposed vein. "I think we found it." The donkey wandered over to investigate, sniffing at the rocks with the serious attention he gave to anything Silas found interesting. In the bright winter light, the gold was unmistakable, no, just flakes or traces, but a substantial vein that disappeared into the cliff face and promised more riches than Silas had ever dreamed of. He spent the rest of the day carefully exposing more of the vein, following it back into the rock and discovering that it was even richer than he'd first believed. This wasn't just pocket gold that would play out after a few days of digging. This was the kind of strike that could make a man wealthy enough to buy anything he wanted. As the sun set behind the snow-covered peaks, Silas sat by his fire thinking about what this discovery meant. He could mine this vein through the winter, accumulating enough gold to set himself up for life. He could buy a real ranch, hire men to work for him, live like the wealthy prospectors he'd always envied. But wealth brought its own complications. Rich men had to worry about being robbed, about people trying to befriend them for their money, about knowing whether relationships were real or just elaborate schemes to get close to their gold. Rich men had to wonder if anyone really cared about them or just what they owned. Tobias lay down beside the fire, his presence warm and comforting in the cold mountain air. The donkey's loyalty hadn't changed because of the gold strike. He was the same patient, honest friend he'd always been, and that consistency was worth more than all the precious metal hidden in the rocks. "You know what, boy?" Silas said, scratching behind the donkey's ears. "Maybe having enough is better than having everything." As if in response to his words, a sound drifted across the snowy landscape, the distant ring of metal on stone, like someone digging or prying at rocks. Silas froze, listening intently. He was supposed to be alone up here, cut off from civilization by the early storm. Who else could be working in the mountains on a night like this? The sound came again, closer now and definitely intentional. Someone was out there in the snow and darkness, and they were looking for something, or someone. Silas quietly reached for his rifle, his mind racing through possibilities. Claim jumpers who'd followed him up here, outlaws using the remote location as a hideout, or something else entirely, something that might be connected to Elena and the troubles she'd brought into his life. Tobias had heard it too. His ears pricked forward as he stared into the darkness beyond their fire. The donkey's calm demeanor hadn't changed, but Silas could see the alertness in his posture, the readiness to move if danger approached. Whatever was out there, they would face it together. But first, Silas needed to know what they were dealing with. He banked the fire carefully, plunging their camp into darkness, and prepared to discover who had followed them into the frozen wilderness. 3 figures moved through the snow like ghosts, their dark shapes barely visible against the white landscape. Silas watched them approach from his hidden position behind a fallen log, his rifle ready and his heart hammering against his ribs. Tobias lay beside him, perfectly still but alert, his intelligent eyes tracking the stranger's movements. The leader was a woman bundled in a heavy coat, but something about the way she moved was familiar. Behind her came 2 men, tall and lean, the other stocky and bearded, both carrying the kind of weapons that meant serious business. They moved with the careful coordination of people who'd worked together before, scanning the area around Silas's camp with professional thoroughness. "I told you he'd be here," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the still mountain air. "Silas never gives up on anything, especially not his father's dreams." The voice hit Silas like a physical blow. Elena, somehow, impossibly, she was here in the mountains instead of in jail where she belonged. But how? And why had she brought armed men to his isolated camp? "You sure this is the right place?" asked the stocky man, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Looks abandoned to me." "He's here," Elena said with certainty that made Silas's skin crawl. "He's just being careful." Silas learned not to trust people too quickly. The bitter irony in her words wasn't lost on him. Elena talking about trust after what she'd done was like a thief lecturing about honesty. But her presence here, free and apparently in charge of her own movements, raised questions that made his situation much more dangerous. "Silas!" Elena called out, her voice echoing off the rock walls around them. "I know you're listening. I need to talk to you." He stayed hidden, watching as the 3 figures spread out to search his camp more thoroughly. They moved like people accustomed to dangerous situations, checking corners and blind spots with the efficiency of professionals. The 2 men weren't just hired help, they were experienced at this kind of work. "Come on, Silas," Elena continued, her tone shifting to something more pleading. "I'm not here to hurt you. I have information you need to hear." Information. The word hung in the cold air like bait in a trap. What kind of information could Elena possibly have that would justify tracking him down in the middle of winter? And how had she escaped from Marshal Garrett and his men? The tall man found the covered mining equipment first, pulling back tarps to reveal picks and shovels and the other tools of a working claim. "He's been busy," the man observed. "This is a serious operation." "Silas always was thorough," Elena said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like pride. When he commits to something, he doesn't do it halfway. The comment stung because it was true, and because it came from someone who'd proven that her own commitments were worth less than promises written in water. Silas shifted position slightly, trying to get a better view of the strangers' faces and weapons. That small movement was his mistake. Tobias, trying to stay close to his human companion, accidentally kicked a loose rock that went rolling down the slope with a sound like thunder in the mountain silence. All three visitors spun toward the noise, their weapons appearing in their hands with practiced speed. "There," Elena said, pointing directly at Silas's hiding place, "behind the fallen tree." Silas cursed silently and stood up, keeping his rifle ready but not directly threatening. Running would be pointless in the deep snow, and Tobias couldn't move quickly enough in these conditions to make escape realistic. "Hello, Elena," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Interesting company you're keeping these days." She pushed back her hood, revealing a face that was thinner than he remembered, marked by stress and sleepless nights. Her dark hair was shorter now, and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Whatever had happened to her since the marshals took her away hadn't been easy. "I need to explain some things," she said, taking a step closer. "About Diego. About what really happened. About why I'm here." "The time for explanations was 3 weeks ago," Silas replied. "Before you got dragged away for collaborating with Apache raiders. Before I found out everything you told me was a lie." The stocky man shifted his grip on his rifle, and Silas noticed the movement immediately. These weren't just Elena's friends, they were her protection, ready to shoot if the conversation went badly. "Diego lied," Elena said urgently. "About the Apache raids, about my family, about everything. He's been trying to destroy me for years, and he finally found a way to make people believe his stories." "So you're innocent?" Silas asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Your family's death was just a tragic coincidence, and your survival was pure luck?" Elena's face crumpled slightly. "No, I'm not innocent, but I'm not guilty of what Diego accused me of either. The truth is more complicated than his simple story of betrayal." "Then, tell me the truth," Silas said. "All of it. No more lies, no more half-stories designed to make me feel sorry for you." Elena glanced at her two companions, who nodded slightly. Whatever arrangement they had, it apparently included permission for her to share certain information. "My family was being threatened by a group of bandits led by a man named Cortez," she began. "They weren't Apache, they were Mexican outlaws who dressed like Apache to avoid blame for their raids. Cortez gave my father an ultimatum: pay him $1,000 or watch his family die." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. If Elena was telling the truth, then everything Diego had said was wrong. But if she was lying again, then this was just another elaborate story designed to manipulate his feelings. "My father didn't have $1,000, Elena continued, "but he knew where to find it. Samuel Morrisonth, man whose marriage arrangement you bought, was my father's friend. Samuel had been courting me for months, hoping to convince me to marry him." The pieces of a different puzzle were starting to come together in Silas's mind. Samuel Morrison hadn't been a stranger whose papers he'd accidentally purchased. He'd been connected to Elena's story from the beginning. "Samuel offered to help," Elena said. "He would give my father the money to pay off Cortez, and in return, I would agree to marry him. It seemed like the perfect solution. My family would be safe, and Samuel would get the wife he wanted." "But something went wrong," Silas guessed. Elena nodded, tears starting to freeze on her cheeks in the bitter cold. "Samuel paid the money, but Cortez took it and killed my family anyway. He said dead witnesses couldn't testify against him. I survived because I was in Santa Fe with Samuel, making arrangements for our wedding." If this version was true, then Elena had been a victim, not a collaborator. But Silas had learned to be careful about believing stories that were designed to make him sympathetic. "Why should I believe you?" he asked. "You've lied to me before." "Because," Elena said, reaching into her coat pocket, "I have proof." She pulled out a leather pouch and tossed it toward Silas's feet. When he opened it, gold coins spilled onto the snow, more money than he'd ever seen in one place. "That's Samuel's payment to Cortez?" Elena explained. "The money that was supposed to save my family. I found it hidden in Cortez's camp after the bandits were killed by real Apache warriors." Silas stared at the gold, his mind reeling. If Elena was telling the truth, then she'd not only been innocent of her family's murder, but had actually recovered the blood money that had cost their lives. "The marshals believed me when I showed them the evidence," Elena continued. "Diego's story fell apart when they investigated properly. Cortez and his men are all dead now, killed by Apache, who didn't appreciate being blamed for crimes they didn't commit." "So you're free?" Silas asked. "I'm free," Elena confirmed. "And I came back to find you because I owe you an explanation, and because I have something that belongs to you." She nodded to the tall man, who reached into his pack and pulled out something that made Silas's heart stop. His father's silver watch, gleaming in the winter sunlight like a piece of captured starlight. "How do you have that?" Silas whispered. "Samuel Morrison kept it after he bought our marriage arrangement," Elena explained. "When he died, it went to his estate. When I proved my innocence, the territorial court gave me everything that was meant to be mine, including this watch that never should have been sold in the first place." Silas reached out and took the watch with trembling fingers. The metal was cold but familiar, and when he opened it, his father's inscription was still there. "For my son, who will find his own gold." The weight of the timepiece in his hand felt like forgiveness and possibility rolled into one. His father's legacy hadn't been lost after Alit had just taken a longer journey to find its way home. But even as relief flooded through him, Silas realized that Elena's story raised as many questions as it answered, and the presence of armed men in his camp suggested that her trouble sand now his were far from over. A gunshot cracked across the mountain valley like breaking thunder, sending snow cascading from the pine branches and making Tobias jump sideways with alarm. The sound came from the direction of the trail below, too close for comfort and too deliberate to be an accident. "Get down!" shouted the tall man Elena had brought with her, his name apparently Jake. He dove behind a boulder, pulling his rifle into position with military precision. "We've got company!" Elena grabbed Silas's arm, her eyes wide with fear that looked genuinely surprised. "They found us," she whispered. "I thought we had more time." "Who found us?" Silas demanded. But before Elena could answer, more gunshots erupted from multiple positions around their camp. Whoever was attacking knew what they were doing. They'd surrounded the area and were closing in from all sides. The stocky man Bobby, Elena, had called him, scrambled to higher ground behind a fallen tree. "At least 6 shooters," he called out. "Maybe more. They've got us pinned good." Silas felt anger rising in his chest like boiling water. This morning he'd been alone with Tobias, working his claim and living peacefully in the mountains. Now he was trapped in a gunfight with people he didn't know over conflicts he didn't understand. "What did you bring to my camp?" he yelled at Elena as bullets whined off the rocks around them. "Insurance," she yelled back, reloading her pistol with quick, practiced movements. "The kind of people who don't like witnesses to their business." Through the snow and gun smoke, Silas could see figures moving between the treesmen in dark coats, carrying rifles and spreading out to improve their shooting angles. They moved with the coordination of experienced fighters, and their weapons were better than anything frontier outlaws usually carried. "Diego?" Silas asked, though he already suspected the answer would be more complicated. "Diego was just the beginning," Elena said, snapping off a shot at a muzzle flash in the trees. "He works for people who have very long memories and very short patience." Jake had found a good position behind a granite outcrop and was making their attackers pay for every advance. His rifle cracked steadily, and Silas could hear curses and shouts of pain from the woods. This man knew how to fight, and he was buying them precious time. "Over here," Bobby called out, gesturing toward a narrow gap between 2 large boulders. "Natural fort. We can hold them off better from there." Elena grabbed Silas's hand and pulled him toward the defensive position, but he yanked free and ran toward Tobias instead. The donkey was standing in the open, confused and frightened by the gunfire, but not knowing which way to run for safety. "Silas, no!" Elena screamed, but he was already moving. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet as he reached Tobias and grabbed the donkey's halter. The animal's eyes were rolling with fear, but he trusted Silas enough to follow when pulled toward the relative safety of the rocks. "Come on, boy," Silas said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Stay with me." They reached the boulder fort just as the attackers launched a coordinated assault from 3 directions. Jake and Bobby laid down covering fire, while Elena and Silas dragged their essential supplies into the defensive position. Tobias pressed himself against the back wall of their rocky shelter, his presence somehow comforting even in the middle of a firefight. "How long can we hold out?" Silas asked, as bullets chipped stone fragments from their shelter. "Depends on how much ammunition they brought," Jake replied, checking his cartridge belt. "And how badly they want us dead." "They want me alive," Elena said grimly. "The rest of you are expendable." "Who are they?" Silas demanded, but before Elena could answer, a new voice echoed across the valley, cultured, confident, and carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Vasquez, I know you can hear me. This has gone on long enough." Elena's face went pale. "Victor Calderon," she whispered. "I thought he was dead." "Who's Victor Calderon?" Silas asked. "The man who really killed my family," Elena said, her voice barely audible above the gunfire. "Cortez worked for him, but Victor was the one who ordered the raid. He's been hunting me ever since I escaped with evidence that could send him to prison." The pieces of Elena's complicated story were finally coming together, but Silas realized they painted a picture that was far more dangerous than simple revenge. This wasn't about old grudges or territorial disputes. This was about powerful people covering up crimes, and Elena was the only witness who could expose them. "What evidence?" he asked. Elena reached into her coat and pulled out a leather portfolio tied with string. "Letters, financial records, proof that Victor has been organizing raids against Mexican and American settlers for years, stealing their land and selling it to railroad companies." "Miss Vasquez," Victor's voice came again, closer now. "You have something that belongs to me. Return it, and your friends can walk away from this." "He's lying," Jake said flatly. "Men like that don't leave witnesses." Elena knew it too. Her hands were shaking as she clutched the portfolio, but her voice was steady when she called back. "The evidence is already in safe hands, Victor. Killing me won't change anything." A harsh laugh echoed off the mountain walls. "We'll see about that. You always were too clever for your own good." The shooting intensified after that, with Victor's men pressing their attack from multiple angles. They had more ammunition and better positions, and it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed the defenders' rocky shelter. "We need to move," Bobby said during a brief lull in the firing. "This position won't hold much longer." "Where?" Silas asked. "They've got us surrounded." Elena was studying the terrain behind their position, her eyes tracking something Silas couldn't see. "The old mine shaft," she said suddenly. "Your father's maps showed a cave system behind this ridge, if we can reach it." "That's a big if," Jake pointed out. "It's 50 yards of open ground." "Tobias can carry our supplies," Silas said, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. "If we move fast and stay low." "They'll cut us down before we make it halfway," Bobby protested. "Not if we give them something else to think about," Elena said, looking at the portfolio in her hands. "Victor wants these papers more than he wants to kill us. If I make him think I'm going to destroy them—" "You'll draw their fire," Silas realized. "But that's suicide." Elena smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his camp, Silas saw the woman he'd fallen in love with, brave, resourceful, and willing to sacrifice herself for others. "Not if you trust me one more time," she said. "And if Tobias is as smart as I think he is?" As if he understood his part in whatever plan Elena was developing, Tobias stepped forward and nuzzled her shoulder. The donkey's calm presence in the middle of chaos was a reminder that sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected sources. "What do you need us to do?" Silas asked, and realized he'd made his decision to trust her again, not because her story was perfect, but because the alternative was watching her die trying to protect them all. Elena's smile was answer enough. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, partners again, fighting for their lives and their future in the snowy mountains where it had all begun. Elena stepped out from behind the boulder with her hands raised high, the leather portfolio clearly visible in her right fist. Snow continued to fall around her like a curtain of white, and her voice carried across the valley with the clear tone of someone making a final bargain. "Victor, I have your precious papers right here. You want them? Come and get them yourself." The gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat. Elena stood exposed in the open, completely vulnerable but somehow radiating more strength than any of the armed men hidden in the trees around them. "You're in no position to make demands, Miss Vasquez." Victor's voice came from somewhere to their left, but he sounded closer, now close enough, that Silas could hear the mixture of anger and desperation beneath his cultured tone. "I'm in the perfect position," Elena called back. "These papers are the only thing keeping me alive, and we both know it. So here's my offer: you let my friends go, and I'll give you what you want." Behind the rocks, Jake was shaking his head vigorously. "Don't trust him," he whispered, "the minute he gets those papers." "I know," Silas replied quietly. "But Elena has a plan. We just need to be ready." Tobias was loaded with their essential supplies and waiting patiently near the back of their shelter. The donkey's dark eyes were alert, watching Elena's performance with the kind of intelligent attention that made Silas think he understood more about their situation than any animal should. "How do I know you won't run the moment I show myself?" Victor asked, and Silas could hear movement in the woodsmen, repositioning themselves for a better shot. "Because I'm tired of running," Elena said, and there was truth in her voice that made Silas's chest tight with emotion. "Because I want this to end one way or another." She took 3 steps forward, moving away from their protective rocks and closer to the open ground between their position and the mine shaft Elena had spotted. The portfolio was still held high, but Silas noticed she was positioning herself carefully, not just as bait, but as a shield. "There's something else you should know, Victor," Elena called out, her voice carrying a new note of confidence. "I wasn't the only survivor of your raids. There are others, and they've been talking to the territorial authorities." "You're lying." Victor's response came too quickly, revealing more desperation than he probably intended. "Am I? Ask yourself why the federal marshals were in these mountains 3 weeks ago. Ask yourself why they were so interested in hearing Diego's story about Apache raids that never happened." Silas felt a chill of understanding. Elena's arrest hadn't been random, it had been part of a larger investigation into Victor's crimes. She hadn't just been clearing her own name, she'd been helping to build a case against the man who'd destroyed her family. "The net is closing, Victor," Elena continued. "These papers are just the final piece of evidence they need to hang you. So what's it going to be? Surrender now and maybe live to see trial, or die in these mountains like the coward you've always been?" The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Victor's voice came again, and this time it was full of cold rage. "Kill them all." That was the signal Elena had been waiting for. She spun around and dove behind a fallen log just as gunfire erupted from every direction. But instead of keeping the portfolio safe, she threw it high into the air, where it spun end over end against the gray sky like a bird with broken wings. "Now!" she screamed. Silas and the others moved instantly. Jake and Bobby provided covering fire, while Silas grabbed Tobias's lead rope and started running toward the mine shaft Elena had spotted. The donkey followed without hesitation, his hooves finding sure footing in the treacherous snow. Behind them, Victor's men were shooting at the falling portfolio, trying to destroy the evidence even as they pursued the escaping prisoners. Papers scattered like confetti in the wind, but Silas noticed that Elena was smiling as she ran the smile of someone whose gamble had paid off exactly as planned. They reached the mine shaft just as Victor himself emerged from the trees, a well-dressed man in his 50s whose face was twisted with fury. He raised his rifle toward Elena's retreating form, but Jake's shot sent him diving for cover before he could fire. "Inside," Elena gasped. pointing toward the dark opening in the mountainside. The mine shaft was narrow and steep, but it led down into a natural cave system that his father's maps had marked but never fully explored. Tobias balked at the darkness, but Silas coaxed him forward with gentle words and steady pressure on his lead rope. "Trust me, boy," he said. "We've come this far together." Behind them, they could hear Victor's men approaching the mine entrance, their voices echoing off the rock walls as they debated whether to follow their quarry into the unknown depths. "They could be anywhere in there," someone said. "Could be a dead end," another voice added. "Or a trap," a third man suggested. But Victor's voice cut through their uncertainty with cold authority. "I don't care if it leads to hell itself. Find them." As they descended deeper into the mine, Elena moved up beside Silas. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "What?" "The portfolio I threw in the air? It was full of blank paper. The real evidence is sewn into the lining of my coat." Silas stared at her in amazement. "You fooled them completely." "I fooled Victor," Elena corrected. "But his men aren't stupid. Once they realize what happened, they'll come after us harder than ever." "Then we'd better hope this mine goes somewhere useful," Jake said from behind them. As if in answer to his words, Tobias suddenly perked up his ears and quickened his pace. The donkey had caught scent of something that interested him, and his eagerness suggested it might be their salvation. "Water," Elena said, recognizing the sound of running water echoing from deeper in the cave. "There's an underground stream down here." "Which means another way out," Silas realized. "Streams don't just disappear, they flow somewhere." The sound of pursuit was growing fainter behind them as they followed Tobias deeper into the mountain's heart. The donkey's instincts were leading them towards something, whether it was safety, treasure, or just another dead end remained to be seen. But for the first time since Victor's men had attacked their camp, Silas felt something like hope stirring in his chest. They were alive, they were together, and they had Tobias to guide them through the darkness. Sometimes that was enough to build a future on. The cave stretched ahead of them, full of shadows and possibilities, and their footsteps echoed like promises in the ancient stone corridors where his father had once searched for gold. Maybe the real treasure had been the partnership he'd found with Elena and the loyal friendship of a donkey who'd never let him down. Behind them, Victor's angry voice echoed off the cave walls, but it was growing fainter with each step they took toward whatever lay ahead in the mountain's hidden depths.